Let me begin by stating something that is not often said, not because it's untrue, but because it's uncomfortable. Human beings are fundamentally biological, psychological, and spiritual creatures. And one of the core features of our biological structure, one that we often try to push into the shadows, is our sexuality. Now, here's the tragedy. As people age, particularly men, they begin to detach from that dimension of their lives. Sometimes it's due to cultural shame, sometimes due to religious guilt, sometimes it's because of physical decline. But here's the thing, neglecting this part of yourself has consequences, real, measurable, psychological, and physiological consequences. Let's walk through that. When we talk about aging, we often focus on surface level aspect, wrinkles, slowed movement, perhaps even cognitive decline. But what's not commonly discussed is how aging affects a person's physiological health through systems that are tied to sexuality, specifically in men. One of the most underappreciated areas of this discussion revolves around prostate health. The prostate is a gland involved in seminal fluid production, and it's heavily influenced by frequency of ejaculation. This isn't abstract, it's not speculative. There's substantial empirical research suggesting that men who ejaculate regularly, whether through intercourse or masturbation, experience a significantly lower risk of prostate-related diseases, including prostate cancer. Why would this be the case? Well, the body is a system of inputs and outputs. The prostate, like any biological structure, requires stimulation, activity, and clearance. Ejaculation, in this context, serves as a natural mechanism of maintenance. When men abstain for long periods of time, particularly in later stages of life, this can lead to stagnation. Fluids are retained longer than they should be. Inflammatory processes can begin to accumulate. And over time, this can develop into pathological conditions. Now, people don't like to talk about this because it feels embarrassing. It confronts taboos about sexuality and aging. But neglecting this conversation comes with a cost, and it's a cost measured in quality of life and physical well-being. There's also the hormonal component. Testosterone, the primary male sex hormone, tends to decline with age. That decline isn't just about libido. It affects energy levels, cognitive sharpness, emotional resilience, and muscle integrity. Masturbation, especially when paired with arousal and psychological engagement, can contribute to hormonal regulation. It signals to the body that it is still in use, still active, still alive in the most primal sense. The body responds to engagement. It withers when ignored. If you treat your sexuality as something to be shelved the moment you pass 60 or 70, your biology will follow suit. Systems that aren't used begin to atrophy. Now, of course, this isn't about compulsive behavior or replacing healthy relationships with indulgence, but it is about recognizing that your sexual biology doesn't just disappear. It doesn't evaporate with age, it simply changes, and in some ways becomes more important to attend to because the body no longer operates on youthful autopilot. You have to take more intentional care of it. That includes the systems linked to reproductive health. Ignoring these needs out of guilt, shame, or denial can lead to measurable medical problems. Regular ejaculation helps cleanse the prostate, stabilizes hormonal rhythms, and sustains systems that are integral to male health. When you suppress this part of your biology in the name of false dignity, you're not being disciplined. You're being self-destructive. You're refusing to acknowledge the truth of your own embodied nature. And the body, ignored for too long, tends to punish neglect with dysfunction. So the question isn't whether masturbation in old age is appropriate. The question is, are you willing to care for your health and vitality with honesty, maturity, and responsibility? As men grow older, one of the most consistent biological realities they face is a natural decline in testosterone levels. This decline is gradual, beginning as early as the late 30s or early 40s, and it accelerates over time. Now, testosterone is not merely a hormone responsible for libido. It's a biological regulator that influences a wide spectrum of physical and psychological functions, ranging from energy production, bone density, and muscle retention, to emotional stability, cognitive clarity, and motivation. It's essential to understand that testosterone isn't just about sex. It's about drive itself. It's about the ability to act in the world with force and conviction. As this hormone diminishes, so too does the physiological signal that says, engage, act, move forward. Men who are unaware of this slow transformation may misinterpret the symptoms lethargy, irritability, brain fog, or even low-grade depression. They think it's just part of getting old. And while aging does bring changes, some of these changes are avoidable or manageable, but only if you're willing to interact consciously with your body. One way to do that is through continued sexual activity, including masturbation. Engaging in sexual stimulation causes a cascade of hormonal responses, including temporary boosts in testosterone and dopamine. These responses help regulate the system. It's like giving a tired engine a much-needed oil change. The refusal to engage sexually in old age, whether from shame or a misplaced sense of stoicism, actually amplifies the very symptoms men wish to avoid. Avoidance becomes a kind of slow surrender, and over time, a man begins to disengage from his own vitality, not just physically, but existentially. He begins to operate in a more diminished state, not because he is doomed to do so by age, but because he has withdrawn from one of the mechanisms that keeps his biology attuned and alive. Now, it's not just about testosterone in the abstract. It's about homeostasis, a balance in the hormonal system. Sexual stimulation and ejaculation help maintain that balance. Think of it as a recalibration of the internal machinery. When that machinery is left idle for too long, it falters. It becomes rusty. The energy needed to function in daily life dissipates, and that often contributes to a kind of passive nihilism, a sense that life is no longer worth engaging in fully. Older men are frequently told to accept the gradual erosion of their bodies and minds as an unavoidable reality. And while aging is indeed inevitable, decline is not the same as decay. There's a difference between allowing something to transform naturally and allowing it to collapse due to inattention. Maintaining a healthy sexual relationship with yourself, especially in the absence of a partner, is not only natural, it's an act of responsibility toward your well-being. You're not just keeping testosterone flowing. You're preserving your capacity for action, your emotional regulation, and your sense of self. To abandon that without reflection is to walk away from one of the few tools you have to stay sharp, grounded, and vital in your later years. One of the greatest errors we make in modern society is assuming that sexuality is merely a biological act, a mechanical release, driven by instinct. That's a deeply reductionist view of human nature. Sexuality, in truth, is a central pillar of identity. It's not just about pleasure or reproduction. It's about how we relate to ourselves and how we orient ourselves in the world. When people age, they often unconsciously begin to detach from their own sexual identity, treating it as something that belonged to a previous phase of life. They no longer feel desirable, they no longer desire, and they tell themselves it's normal, perhaps even noble, to put that part of themselves away. But that detachment comes at a cost. When you sever a part of yourself, and that's what we're talking about here, an internal severing, you lose more than desire. You lose vitality, you lose creativity, and worst of all, you begin to lose a certain kind of honesty with yourself. The individual begins to view themselves not as a whole being, but as a deteriorating version of their former self. That's not just physically unhealthy, it's psychologically devastating. And this repression is rarely purely physical. It's often rooted in shame. Cultural, religious, or familial narratives teach people, especially in older generations, that sexuality is only acceptable under certain conditions in youth, within marriage, for procreation. Once those boxes are unchecked, many begin to feel that continuing to engage in their own sexuality, especially alone, is perverse or inappropriate. But that shame doesn't cleanse, it corrodes. It doesn't make a person stronger. It diminishes their sense of self-worth. As you age, your body changes, that's inevitable. But if you lose connection with it entirely, you begin to see yourself not as a full human being, but as a faded image. Sexuality reminds you that you are still here, still capable of feeling, still capable of intimacy, even if that intimacy is now primarily with yourself. And that isn't something to be mocked. That's something to be respected. It's a form of maintaining psychological integration, keeping the many aspects of the self connected, rather than letting some atrophy through denial. Now, the psyche does not tolerate fragmentation well. If you bury your sexuality, it doesn't disappear. It reemerges in distorted forms through envy, through resentment, or even through disconnection and depression. I've seen men, especially, who no longer engage with their own sexual lives become withdrawn, bitter, confused about their purpose. It's not always conscious, but the underlying belief is, I no longer matter. Reconnecting with one's sexuality is not indulgence. It's an act of reclaiming identity, of affirming that your worth isn't tied to age or to cultural approval, but to your presence, your aliveness. To ignore that is to live in fragmentation, but to acknowledge it, even quietly, is to step toward wholeness. There's a certain kind of quiet tragedy in how people treat their bodies as they age. It's not just physical neglect, it's a deeper form of psychological disownment. For many, the body becomes a reminder of loss. Loss of youth, of strength, of attraction, of identity. And so they start to withdraw from it, often without even realizing they're doing so. They stop exploring. They stop expressing, they stop listening. Over time, they stop believing that their body is worth caring for at all. But the moment you stop engaging with your body, you begin to lose contact with your aliveness, and the effects of that are profound. When you masturbate, particularly in old age, you are making a subtle but powerful declaration. I still belong to myself. That isn't an act of vanity, it's an act of affirmation. It's saying, I am still here in this body. I still matter, even now. And that's a far more important message than people realize. Because when a person disconnects from their body, they don't just lose physical engagement, they begin to lose personal coherence. They begin to treat themselves like a utility, or worse, like a burden. They perform the motions of life, but without the sensation of actually inhabiting it. Sexual expression, even when solitary, is one of the few moments where a person is completely present. It's not about performance or productivity. It's not about what others think. It's a rare act of intimacy with the self, and that's incredibly valuable, especially in a world that constantly tells older individuals that their value is fading. Society often forgets them. Sometimes even their families do. But the deeper damage happens when they start forgetting themselves, when they start believing that invisibility is their new identity. Staying connected to your body through pleasure is one way of resisting that invisibility. It's not about indulgence, it's about integration. The body, the mind, the soul, these aren't separate entities. They're part of a single, unified system. When you abandon one, the others suffer. A man who believes he's too old for desire has already begun to accept a kind of spiritual extinction. He tells himself he's being dignified, but often he's simply grieving in silence, grieving a part of himself he's been told he's no longer allowed to access. There's no shame in wanting to feel alive. There's no guilt in tending to your own body, in seeking moments of intimacy with yourself. That isn't a rejection of age, it's a deeper acceptance of what aging truly means. Aging isn't about becoming less human. It's about becoming more human, more conscious, more aware, more responsible for the parts of yourself that used to run on instinct. So when an older man chooses to engage sexually with himself, he's not clinging to youth, he's anchoring himself in life. He's choosing presence over withdrawal, and that choice can mean the difference between merely existing and actually living. One of the most fascinating elements of the aging process is how it reshapes our relationship to loneliness, especially in men. As life progresses, many of the structures that provided routine connection, career, family obligations, physical vitality begin to fade or change. Children move away, spouses pass on, friendships become infrequent, and gradually what's left is silence. Now, silence in itself isn't bad, it can be peaceful, even sacred. But for many older men, it becomes a kind of void, a vacuum not just of noise, but of intimacy, closeness, and physical affection. The absence of touch is not trivial. Human beings are biologically wired to respond to physical contact. It regulates stress, it releases oxytocin, the hormone of bonding, it helps the body self-soothe. When there's a complete absence of touch over long periods, the nervous system becomes dysregulated. The person becomes more irritable, more anxious, more prone to depression. These aren't just emotional states, they're biological consequences of physical deprivation. Now here's the part that people don't talk about because they're afraid to say it out loud. Self-stimulation can be a form of therapeutic touch. For the man who lives alone, who no longer experiences physical closeness from another, this becomes not only acceptable, but essential. It's a way of reminding the body that it hasn't been abandoned, that it still deserves care, still deserves sensation. It isn't shameful, it's a form of self-respect. What's astonishing is how many men in their later years repress this need entirely. They begin to believe that wanting physical intimacy even with oneself is weak or inappropriate, that they should somehow rise above it in the name of maturity. But the cost of that mindset is often spiritual erosion. Because loneliness isn't just about being alone, it's about losing the sense of being seen and felt. When you touch yourself with intention, with presence, you're saying to yourself, I still exist. That has profound psychological implications. It grounds you in the body. It keeps you in contact with your own being. It's important to note that this isn't about fantasy or addiction. It's not escapism. It's about embodiment, about choosing to inhabit your physical form with care instead of neglect. Older men, especially those living in isolation, often fall into a pattern of detachment. Days blur together. Sensory experiences diminish, and without realizing it, they begin to vanish from their own lives. But there's a way back. Simple acts like mindful touch, intentional release can help reverse that fading. It's not a miracle. It won't solve every problem, but it's a start. It's a step toward healing the very human need for connection, even if that connection, for now, must begin from within. We are not built to live entirely without affection, and when the world grows quiet, sometimes it's up to us to create that intimacy not out of desperation, but out of a deep personal commitment to staying whole even in solitude. We live in a culture where sexuality is increasingly discussed in public. Yet when it comes to the elderly, particularly elderly men, the topic is shrouded in awkward silence. Society projects a narrow view of desire, as though it has an expiration date. And if a man continues to engage in sexual expression in his later years, it's often seen as strange, inappropriate, or even pathetic. But that perception says more about our discomfort with aging than it does about biology. Because biologically, the systems tied to arousal, touch, and sexual engagement remain active long into old age, provided they are not suppressed by neglect or shame. And that brings us to a deeper truth. The denial of sexual expression in later life can become a form of repression that leads to psychological damage. When a person chronically represses a fundamental aspect of their being, it doesn't just go away, it turns inward. It starts to distort other dimensions of the psyche. The individual may become more irritable, more cynical, more withdrawn. Emotional resilience decreases. Their capacity for joy, curiosity, and warmth begins to erode. That isn't aging. That's the consequence of disconnection, of cutting off a vital life current that once provided energy, identity, and self-recognition. Now, one might ask, why does it matter so much? Why can't a man simply move on from sexuality as he gets older? And the answer is this: because you cannot amputate part of your humanity and expect to remain whole. You can numb it, yes, you can ignore it. You can drown it in work, distractions, or isolation. But eventually the soul starts to whisper, and then it starts to scream, not because it demands indulgence, but because it demands integration. Sexuality is not just about pleasure. It's about power, not dominance, but the power of self-recognition. When you abandon that part of yourself due to social pressure or internal guilt, you're not becoming more disciplined. You're becoming fractured, and when a person fractures enough times internally, they begin to lose a sense of direction. They no longer know what they want. They no longer know who they are. They become adrift in their own skin. For the aging man, choosing to remain sexually connected, even if through masturbation, is an act of quiet rebellion against that fragmentation. It's not a cry for attention. It's a declaration of wholeness. It says, I refuse to disappear. It says, I still belong to myself. That has real psychological consequence. It reinforces agency. It preserves identity. It anchors the individual in the present moment, instead of allowing him to drift into a narrative of slow decay. And when that wholeness is maintained, something remarkable happens. Dignity returns, not the dignity society imposes, but the kind that rises from within, the kind that says, I am still here, I am still real, and I still matter. Conclusion: integration, not suppression if you want to age with dignity, vitality, and psychological integrity. You must integrate your sexuality, not exile it. You are not meant to become a hollow version of your younger self. You are meant to become a wiser, deeper version of who you've always been. That includes your desire. That includes your pleasure. That includes the simple, humble act of connecting with yourself, even sexually. So don't let shame steal your spark. Don't let dogma rob you of your vitality. If you're still alive, then live, and truly living means embracing the whole of who you are. Even now, especially now.